Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we have a Q&A on the subject of submachine guns. Like that super cool submachine gun. I have 4 pages of questions here that were contributed by the fine folks on the Forgotten Weapons Patreon who make Forgotten Weapons possible. Thank you to all of you folks. If you would like to submit a question, or if you would just like to see a feed of Forgotten Weapons videos 4 times a week without any ads, then hit up the Patreon, sign up, and that ad-free stream goes to everybody in the Patreon, regardless of pledge level. Anyway, let's dig into our first question, which is a bit of a long one. This comes from Tor, who says, you've traveled the world and met different cultures. How do you see that reflected in their gun or submachine gun designs, i.e. the Germans and their respect for any doctor title and love for over-engineering? The crude Russian designs, the Czech sweet spot in between, the French with a very layered society and either incredibly complex or hideously simple solutions. The Brits, he goes on, to summarize, do you see a link between the cultures you've met and the guns they come up with? And it's very tempting on a question like this to say yes, and basically reiterate all of the cultural stereotypes that he set out here. But when I thought about it more seriously, I realized the answer is, boringly, no. What we will sometimes see a few minor elements of firearms that are stereotypical to a given country, but the guns that are produced in a country are much more influenced by the specific circumstances of their manufacture than they are by a national stereotypical culture. So, for example, if we look at the Sten gun is not a pile of spare plumbing parts because British industry was like predisposed to that sort of thing. It's a pile of spare plumbing parts because it was designed to be as cheap and fast to manufacture as possible because the Brits needed those Sten guns right the heck now. And if we compare the Sten to other guns or other submachine guns made under similar circumstances, you'll see a lot of similarities. You compare them to late war German or Japanese firearms, submachine guns, or just everything else they were making, you'll see the same sort of very crude manufacture. For the British, the low point of the war was fairly early. For the Germans, it was very late. But that's when you see guns that are the same. If we look at American submachine guns, we can kind of see all of the different stereotypes. The Thompson, the first American submachine gun, is very high quality. It's way too heavy. It's way too big. Extremely finely made and very expensive. But then that transitions to a number of other sort of middle-of-the-road guns, like the Marlin or United Defense UD-42. Later in the war, we realize that this stamped thing works just fine, and it's a lot cheaper, and so the US goes to the stamped M3 grease gun. You don't have a lot of stereotypical Americanness in the American submachine guns outside of their caliber, which is a little bit of a stereotypically American thing, but that's just dictated by logistics and what the Army was doing in general. It's not like they took a look at 2 different cartridges when they started to do submachine guns and went, boy, we'd better take the bigger one so that fits with you know, the cowboy spirit that we're known for around the world. Yeah, similarly, like the French designs, you have early war, or pre-war, you have the Mas 38, which is a pretty nicely made. It's not creme de la creme, but it's a fully machined submachine gun with a fair number of interesting features. And then that transitions after the war, following international trends, to the Mat 49, mostly, well, almost all stamped, much simpler, much cruder looking. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't see, it'd be really cool to say that I did see a connection between different cultures and their submachine guns, and I unfortunately just don't. Paul says, in your candid opinion, what do you think is the world's first submachine gun? It's between the Germans and the Italians fighting each other. Yeah, so the 2 perennial contenders for this are the Villa Perosa, in Italian service, and the German MP-18. Now, some people will claim that the Villa Perosa is not a true submachine gun, and they have a very good point. In many ways, they are correct. In that case, the competition then becomes the MP-18 versus like the 1918 pattern submachine guns that the Italians made using Villa Perosas, by like chopping the Villa Perosa double guns in half, putting normal stocks on them, and using them as traditional submachine guns. The Villa Perosa clearly was the first of these two guns to actually come out and see service. I would tend to agree that it is not fundamentally a submachine gun, because while it may meet the technical considerations, classifications, depending on how you look at them, it definitely did not meet the tactical, practical expectation of a submachine gun that we have today. Because frankly, this was a new concept and people were trying a bunch of different stuff. And so the Italians tried something that had some validity, especially in high mountain fighting, but didn't fit the mold that we'd get used to decades later. So if we make it the Italian submachine guns versus the German ones, I don't know which is technically the first to have actually seen combat, but I'm going to give the nod to the German MP-18 because it's the first gun that was clearly used in significant numbers in exactly the sort of role that we ascribe to the submachine gun today. So yes, Paul, I will give it to the Germans on that one. Makovet says, rounds per minute also means mags per minute. What are some typical loadouts for subguns in a military context you have seen? They are typically a minimum of usually 3 magazines, often 4 or 5, and sometimes 6, and occasionally even more than that. So, for example, I've been dealing with Finnish stuff a lot just recently. The Finns, when they adopted the 70 or 71 round drum for the Suomi, they were initially issuing those things out 5 drums per gun, which gives you 350 rounds per gun on the soldier, which is about the most that you'll see. That gets to be a fairly heavy load. Now, the thing for the Finns is they had that loadout because the drums took a really long time. They were a pain in the butt to reload. And the idea was you needed to have enough drums that you could keep shooting until your buddies had time to reload the first empty drum for you. So that's kind of where that came from. When they went to 50-round coffin mags, I believe it was originally 7 per gun, which is that same 350 rounds. You will see a lot of 4 and 5 round pouches for submachine guns, and that can be, you know, if the Thompson had 5 pouches for 30 round mags, that gives you 150. You will see 4 mag pouches for Berettas with a 40 round magazine, that gives you 200 rounds. Honestly, you're looking at a loadout that's not that different from the ammunition loadout that would be given to a guy with a semi-automatic rifle. You know, today's combat loadout for an M16 is typically 7 magazines. That's 210 rounds. That's not that much different than having 4 or 5 or 6 30 or 40 round submachine gun mags. All right, Paul, not sure if this is the same Paul or a different one, says, actually didn't write very coherently. His question is essentially, why is the MP5 still a good submachine gun or pistol caliber carbine today? Why is it still in use by so many military and police forces, given the fact that it's 60 plus years old now? And the answer is a couple of things. First off, the MP5 is objectively a very good submachine gun. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like, you could compare it to a Glock. It doesn't do a lot of things best in its class. It doesn't have the best trigger. It's an trigger. It has some real problems with things like reloading. You essentially cannot reload an MP5 with a loaded magazine on a closed bolt. And it's a closed bolt gun, and it doesn't lock open on an empty magazine. So your reloading procedure really is you have to manually lock the thing open, then reload it, then close the bolt, which is really a subpar thing. If someone came up with that design on a brand new submachine gun, everyone would pan it as a terrible idea. Why on earth would you do this? The MP5 is pretty good for weight. It's controllable. It's the sights. I've never really liked the HK drum sights, but some people do. But what the MP5 gets is this all-around package, much like the Glock. The Glock doesn't have the best trigger, doesn't have the best ergonomics, but it's safe, it's reliable, and people have gotten to recognize it as a very good choice. No one ever got fired for picking Glocks out of, you know, to arm a police or military force. No one really ever got fired for picking the MP5 either. There are lots of really good arguments for it. And on top of that, it's it's kind of got that meme status. It's a memorable gun. And I don't mean meme in a derogatory, like jokey internet way. I mean in a sticky mental, like widely known fact sort of way, where people saw the MP5 in a couple of really high profile, elite, high-speed, low-drag operators operating sort of circumstances, the British, Iranian embassy siege, that sort of thing, and that sticks. And people today, you can't, like, not all procurement guys are nearly as gun nerdy as a bunch of you guys watching this video. They're not going to know everything. This is part of why we will regularly see dumb procurement decisions, or procurement decisions that are made clearly in ignorance of some important criteria or facts. Those guys may not know everything about guns, but the chances are pretty good that they know the MP5 has a reputation as a good gun. And I think that, combined with the fact that it legitimately is a very good all-around package, is why we still see them around today so widely. Verda says, given the adoption of short-barreled intermediate caliber carbines over the past few decades, is the SMG essentially obsolete in terms of military use, or does it still fulfill niches that even something like an Mark 18 or an AKS 74U Krinkov can't fill? We have a similar question from Cody, who says, do you think 300 Blackout short-barreled rifles have completely replaced submachine guns in modern use, or do those still have a niche? This is an interesting question, and it's a little bit of a difficult one for me to answer, because I think some things are still in flux. I think, especially when it comes to 300 Blackout, the concept is still percolating its way into a lot of agencies. For one thing, 300 Blackout really only makes sense as a suppressed weapon. If you're gonna, like, there's no reason to shoot subsonic 300 Blackout without a suppressor. And if you're not shooting subsonic, if you're shooting supersonic 300 Blackout, there's really no reason to pick it over a 5.56. To me, 300 Blackout's specialty is being suppressed subsonic and effective. And supersonic is just sort of a sideshow. It's there as an alternative option if you need it, so that this gun can operate by itself without having to have something like an AR as a backup, a 5.56 as a backup. But there are still a lot of police and security units that don't just automatically put suppressors on everything. And if you're not going to suppress it, 300 Blackout really doesn't stick out as a terribly cool, optimal, useful choice. So for the time being, I think there are a lot of agencies that look at 300 Blackout and say, well, it's rifle-sized, it's rifle magazines. Why don't we just stick with the rifle that we already have? And the potential benefit of it as a suppressed firearm hasn't really sunk in a lot of places. So there's that. When it comes to the idea of, do I want a submachine gun versus a short-barreled carbine in 300? The benefit that the submachine guns have is typically going to be durability and the fact that you can just ignore them a lot more without repercussions. Something like that, open bolt, simple blowback submachine gun, doesn't have a lot to go wrong with it. You don't need to know how to tweak gas systems, adjust the gas port, deal with rings, clean the gas piston, like fouling in the chamber. It doesn't really care. And there's a value to that. There really is a benefit to that. How long would our typical 300 Blackout short-barreled carbines that are optimized to be able to run suppressed and unsuppressed on supersonic and subsonic loads, how long are those things going to run in a really nasty, true military context? Like if you took those out to Ukraine today, how long would they run out in the fields in Ukraine? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that something like that would run longer. If I have officers who are assigned these weapons who aren't particularly specialized in them and don't really know how they work inside and don't need to know how they work inside, just, you know, which end the bullets come out of and how to aim the thing, a PCC or a submachine gun is going to have a lower barrier of entry and operation than a short-barreled carbine. So I think for the time being, yeah, the pistol caliber stuff does still have a place. If everybody was optimally knowledgeable, would it still? That's harder to say. Guido says MP5s in 10 millimeter. Would that bridge the gap somewhat to a short-barreled, lesser performance 5.56 in range and effect on target? I mean, compared to 9 or 45 45 caliber submachine guns, the 10 millimeter should have better range with decent barrel length compared to a 9. 250 yard range doable. I don't think so. I don't think caliber makes that much difference in submachine guns. In fact, let's jump to one of my other questions here. Hold on one moment. Byron said, does cartridge matter? Is there enough of a difference in performance between ammunition types that makes one preferable over the others? 32, 9mm, 10mm, 45. My opinion on this is for a submachine gun, it really doesn't make a difference. In a military context, generally speaking, if you hit someone, you've won. Yeah, there are always going to be examples of the Rambo guys who take 18 bullet hits and keep fighting and defeat an entire enemy company by themselves, but that's pretty exceptional stuff. Generally speaking, the goal is put a bullet on a person. If you accomplish that, to my mind, it doesn't really make much difference what the bullet is. I don't think, you know, there are going to be some extreme variation differences. If you hit someone with a 32 versus a 44 Magnum, they will maybe notice the difference depending on where they get hit. But most of the time, for the cartridges that are sort of in the mid-range, typical for submachine guns, you hit someone, the goal's been accomplished. You don't really have, you know, this is not a damage counter like in video games. And in a police context, even more so. Typically speaking, in a police context, if you show up with a submachine gun, the chances are pretty good that you've just won. If you have to start shooting, if you hit someone in a police context with a submachine gun, you've almost certainly won. It's going to be extremely rare that you know a SWAT team is out there, or even just a beat cop saying, you know, boy, my MP5 wasn't good enough. If only it had been an MP5-10 in 10 millimeter, that would have done the job. Like, that was the FBI's reaction to the Miami shootout in '86, which I think is arguably not the right reaction. It wasn't the response that allowed them to improve performance. It led them to go to a larger caliber cartridge, which then caused them all sorts of secondary training and equipment issues, which led them to then back down from that overpowered cartridge. Anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Does it make a difference? I don't think so. There are a few cases where it's definitely a problem. You will see today very few 45 caliber submachine guns. There are a few legacy ones out there for organizations that have it and really want it. But in general, a 45 caliber submachine gun is going to suffer from heavy magazines and very long magazines. The 45 ACP is a much larger in diameter cartridge than basically everything else out there. And as a result, you get magazines that are a lot bigger and longer for the same capacity. Or if you're stuck with a small capacity, a small physical size, you get fewer cartridges to go around. Frankly, I think one of the things that could be really interesting for submachine guns is, talked about this before, and some of you are gonna, a lot of you are gonna think this is just a stereotypical French Ian response, but 7.65 French, aka 30 Super Carry, I think would make a really neat submachine gun or PCC cartridge, simply because it is smaller in diameter. Most of our cartridges are based on they're roughly 38 caliber, so 0.38 inches in diameter for the back end of the case. And most of the 32 caliber submachine gun cartridges we have, like 357 SIG, well, that's up to 40, like 7.62 Tokarev, are a neck down case. So in terms of magazine capacity and cartridge stacking, you might as well have 9 millimeter because the case is bigger at the back end. 30 Super Carry or 7.65 French, the whole case is only 32.32 inch in diameter. So like a 30 round MOS 38 magazine is pretty darn short and small, and you can carry a lot more ammunition in the same space and weight with that. And I think there's a real potential benefit to that. I have now wandered off enough that I have kind of lost track of what question I was answering and what was the original question. 10 millimeter. Do you get a longer effective range with submachine guns? I generally think no. Traditional submachine guns are going to be open bolt firing. Those are going to be hard to shoot precisely at long range just because of the open bolt nature. You go to closed bolt guns, you've got a little better potential, but pistol caliber cartridges are just not rifle cartridges, and I don't think you really benefit overall by trying to force them to do the role of rifle cartridges. JWL says, why on earth hasn't anyone made a submachine gun in 357 or 44 Magnum? Sounds a bit odd, hear me out. Well, yes, there are rimmed rounds. That's something that can be overcome. Just look at modern shotgun systems, for example. These cartridges have much potential to gain from being fired from longer barrels and enclosed systems without cylinder gaps, and can likely be used in more compact platforms than average 5.56 rifles while still packing a wallop at common ranges. I would counter that these are rimmed cartridges. Look at modern shotgun systems where very few of them work reliably, and the ones that do are often big bulky magazines that have to hold the cartridges out away from each other. People have occasionally tried rimmed cartridge submachine guns, not very often. There was an early Owen gun in a rimmed cartridge. It's not worth it. Like, the magazine issues are too problematic, and while 357 or 44 Magnum does indeed have a lot of potential benefit from a longer barrel because it's a longer case. I would say if someone wanted a subgun in 357 or 44, the first thing I would look at for them would be a subgun in 30 carbine. Something along the lines of, frankly, even just straight M1 or M2 carbine, or the Beretta 57, or the San Cristobal Model 2. There have been guns that were pretty close to submachine gun size in 30 carbine, and they were never particularly popular because I think you lose a lot of the benefits of submachine guns in terms of compactness and controllability when shooting. You could also potentially look to some of the 9mm Mauser stuff, 9x25. There were some early SIG submachine guns in 9x25. Those are hefty. Those are very potent cartridges for a submachine gun. They also proved not particularly popular. 44 Magnum is going to be definitely the worst of these two ideas because in addition to being rimmed, it is, as we just talked about, 44 caliber in diameter. And so you're going to have a big magazine for a relatively limited capacity, and it's going to be a magazine that you're going to have a hard trouble making reliable. Mark says, what is it that makes the Sten magazine not great? Or put it another way, what makes a reliable, robust submachine gun magazine? There are a couple problems with the Sten gun magazine. The first is that it is a single feed magazine. And this is one of those elements that a lot of people will gravitate to. They'll fixate on it. And then assessing a magazine design can very quickly become just a matter of checkboxes like, oh, it's single feed, that's a bad idea because those are bad magazines. And that's not always the case. Single feed has pros and cons. One of the pros is that it means the cartridge is in the same place every time, and it's simpler to design the gun side of the feed mechanism around a system where the cartridge is always in exactly the same place. Double feed magazines are alternating right and left feed, which means the inside of the gun has to be more open and more flexible, and you have to be able to feed from different positions. The issues with the Sten magazine come down to largely friction. There's a lot of friction between the cartridges and the magazine wall in the Sten gun. And then you also have the added friction of that double stack having to converge to a single stack at the top of the magazine. Again, more friction. I think one of the other things that that gives the Sten gun a bad reputation for reliability is it has to feed at the right angle. Of course, this is not unique to the Sten. All submachine guns are going to have a tolerance of what angle of cartridge feeding they can successfully function with. But on the Sten gun, your magazine well is a stamped part. The Sten gun in general is a cheap, high volume, rapid production sort of gun, and you're going to have more instances of a Sten gun magazine well being a little bit out of spec, or the magazine lips getting banged and dented a little bit. The magazine feed lips getting closer or farther apart changes the feed angle. If the mag lips are farther apart at the front, the cartridge will present higher. If they're closer together, it will present lower. And you combine that with a little bit more tolerance in, or a little bit more variability in how the magazine sits in the mag well. Like, is this magazine plus magazine well combination a little loose and rattly, and thus really easy for you to get away from the necessary feed presentation angle? If so, boom, gun's not going to run. Compare that to guns that have much more expensive, finely crafted, milled magazine wells. A gun like the Suomi or like the Thompson. Those are going to be much less likely to have, they're going to have a lot less variability in where the magazine sits. Even something like that MAP 49, the magazine well is the whole length of the front grip. It's, again, there's less space in that magazine well for the magazine to be able to rattle around. You know, if the mag fits in there, it's kind of only got one place that it can fit. All these things together, you know, each one factor that gives you a little bit higher chance at a feed problem, they all stack together on the Sten. So what makes a reliable magazine? One is going to be how much time and expense you put into quality control on both the guns and the magazines. Double stack magazines do tend to be more reliable as long as you build a gun that works with them, which people generally do, but that's a little more work than with a single stack gun. Because if you have a double stack of cartridges that remain a double stack, then you've omitted one potential point of friction. Basically, you want to get rid of friction everywhere. So the Sterling magazine is widely regarded as one of the best submachine gun magazines out there. One of the things it does is actually have rollers on the follower to reduce friction. If you have ribs pressed into the side of the magazine so that the cartridges and or the follower are only in contact with a much smaller surface area, that's going to reduce friction in the magazine as well. All of those elements, anything that will reduce friction generally, will make the magazine more reliable. Let's see. Charles says, are there any currently issued submachine guns in the US military, or have short ARs replaced them all? I know there are some because B&T actually just fairly recently won a contract for a US PDW with the B&T APC 9K, which is very much a 9mm submachine gun. So I'm not entirely clear on exactly what role those are put into. They are PDW, so well, I'm not even going to go out and speculate. But yes, there are in fact submachine guns in US military use currently, and they're not just legacy systems. Although in general, most of the time I think they've probably been replaced by short-barreled carbines, at least for guys whose job is to actively go shoot people. If you've got some MPs and they've still got some machine guns lying around, that's less of an issue than Delta Force deliberately deciding to take a suppressed grease gun instead of the fanciest 8.6 Blackout assault carbine that they can get their hands on. David asks, how prone was the Sten to runaway firing? And was there any real official documentation suggesting its use as a makeshift grenade for room clearing? No, there was not. The Sten was not particularly prone to runaway shooting. Again, there's some myths about the Sten that just aren't true. Now, the Sten was absolutely liable to fire if dropped on the butt of the gun. And this is a common thing with submachine guns, especially early ones. If you have the bolt forward and a magazine in the gun, and you hit a submachine gun on the back of the gun, on the buttstock, what will happen is the gun will stop when it hits the ground. Inertia will cause the bolt to continue moving. And if you have enough force on it, the bolt will come back just enough to clear the magazine, but not catch the sear. It will then pick up a cartridge, chamber it, and in an open bolt firing gun, as soon as that cartridge hits goes into the chamber all the way, it fires. Now, they will only do that once, because once it fires, the recoil energy from firing is enough to lock the bolt open. So you don't get the True Lies thing where the gun falls down the stairs and just sprays the whole room with bullets. That's a movie trope. It doesn't actually happen. Now, it is worth pointing out that there is a potential failure point on the Sten that can lead to runaway firing, and that is if the trigger spring breaks, because the sear, without the spring, the sear will sit in such a position that it won't stop the bolt. So if you're running around and you pull the trigger and the front of the trigger spring goes poink and breaks, the gun will empty itself. However, in practice, that was actually a really rare malfunction to happen. So I guess in theory, you could get a situation where like you trip and drop the gun and the impact on the ground is both in the right direction to pull the bolt back and happens to be the final straw that breaks the trigger spring, and then that gun will pirouette around firing until it's empty. But that's an extremely, like, the guys who were in that room had the same chance of getting hit by lightning. Literary Anarchist says, why didn't the UK have a submachine gun developed before World War II? Every other nation either had a submachine gun in use or were in the process of developing one. Why was Britain ignorant in this need? I think it's a little stretch to say that everybody had one. A lot of people did, but a lot of those countries also didn't have a whole lot of interest in submachine guns. They viewed them as very much specialty weapons. It was the German advance through Europe that I think changed the mind of a lot of European armies as to the viability and the use of submachine guns. You know, the US had Thompsons, but not very many of them. Like, Thompson Auto Ordnance basically essentially went bankrupt because they couldn't sell the Thompsons that they made in 1921 until they finally moved the last of them in 38, 39 when countries in Europe started looking around and going, ah, crap, maybe we ought to get some of these. Submachine guns were not seen as a particularly useful military weapon. They were seen as short-ranged, inaccurate. You know, why would you equip guys with that when you could equip them with a proper rifle? Or more importantly, you've got your whole infantry setup built around light machine guns. What's a submachine gun going to do? It doesn't have the range. You're not going to, you know, in retrospect, clearly submachine guns are very useful combat weapons because military combat tends to be a lot closer ranged and a lot dirtier than everybody always seems to expect it to be. You know, they're always out there making rifles capable of 800-yard shots when, in fact, the number of times those actually get used is minuscule, and virtually everything is in 100 to 200 yards, if not a lot closer than that. So people kind of came to their senses in this regard after World War II. It's frankly surprising that more countries didn't realize this after World War I. Germany did. All right. Eric says, are there any significant differences between PCCs and SMGs, so pistol caliber carbines and submachine guns? I've seen online discourse stating the main difference is select fire versus full auto, respectively. Are there other qualifiers? All right, to my mind, a PCC is a semi-automatic pistol caliber firearm, basically rifle. It is a rifle format gun chambered for a pistol cartridge, and most of these are semi-automatic only versions of submachine guns. Now, PCCs have gotten really common on the civilian market because they're a lot of fun to shoot. They're cheap to shoot. There have been whole competition organizations that have taken off around PCCs, largely 9mm ARs, but there are a bunch of other guns out there. We're seeing more and more, especially closed bolt firing submachine guns that are developed for military or police use being dual purpose and released on the civilian market in semi-automatic form as PCCs for recreational and competition shooting. The Springfield / HS product Kuna is a perfect example of this, and a lot of other guns out there too. HK-MP5, as we've been talking about already in this Q&A. So to me, the only thing that differentiates a PCC from a submachine gun is select or full auto fire. If there's any way you can hit a switch and have more than one round come out with one trigger pull, that's a submachine gun. Although PCCs tend to have longer barrels, they tend to have 16-inch barrels to avoid short-barreled regulations that would make them a little more onerous to obtain and own. So your traditional, very typical PCC is going to be a 9mm AR with a 16-inch barrel on it, where your typical submachine gun is going to have 8 or 10 or maybe a 12-inch barrel, but maybe more like 6 to 10-inch barrels, because the military and the police who are getting submachine guns have no restriction on barrel length to worry about. And for a pistol caliber, you don't need a longer barrel. These are cartridges that are really intended for use in pistols, 2 to 6-inch barrels. So once you get past 10 or so in a longer platform like this, the extra barrel length doesn't really do anything for you. Tyler says, Why do some submachine guns have straight magazines and others have curved magazines while using the same cartridge? MP5 and Uzi versus, or MP40 and Uzi versus MP5 and Scorpion, for example. You can go kind of either way. There's a school of thought that, well, it is true, that if you stack up 9mm parabellum cartridges, they do have a bit of curve to them. And so you will see some magazines that are curved to match that, to reduce friction, just to get a cleaner stack of cartridges. On the other hand, the straight ones kind of work just as well, at least within the 30, 32, maybe 40 round tops capacity that these magazines are generally being manufactured in. You don't need a curved magazine, but some people find that the difference is worthwhile. A curved magazine is also often going to be harder to manufacture. It's a little more complicated to make a curved square tube than to just make a straight square tube. The Scorpion, well, so I think he means the Scorpion as in the Evo 3 Scorpion. The original Scorpion, the VZ61, has a curved magazine because it's using 32 ACP, which is a rimmed or semi-rimmed cartridge, which doesn't need that curvature in order to deal with the rim and essentially making 32 into a tapered cartridge. Cameron says, with the known advantages for the end user, why are there not more submachine gun designs using locking actions or delayed blowback actions compared to the disproportionately high number of direct blowback options? With the context of total war, simpler delayed blowback like the M3 and the Sten makes sense, but even after World War II, simple blowback seemed to continue to dominate. It did, and I think the reason is that they are cheaper and easier to make. They're simpler. Simpler means there's less to go wrong. There really are viable benefits on both sides, and there are quite a lot of people out there who don't necessarily have the skills to exploit the difference in controllability between an open and a closed bolt gun. To my mind, in a military context, simple blowback makes a little more sense because it's simpler. It's going to tend to be more rugged. In a police context, I think closed bolt delayed blowback for locked breech systems make more sense because one certainly hopes that in a police context there's a lot more use of controlled, careful, single semi-automatic shooting than there is in spraying full auto fire around. I think it's a little bit revealing that after World War II, one of the most common police submachine guns in the US was in fact the Rising, which is a delayed blowback closed bolt gun that had reputational problems for durability in places like Guadalcanal and the Solomons, not so much on 3rd Avenue in hometown USA, or for the guy standing guard outside of the Acme Secure Explosives factory. Risings were good. Delayed blowback tends to be lighter. Simple blowback tends to be heavier but cheaper. You'll get customer bases that value both of those, so they both continue to exist. I got a second question from Cameron as well, and that is, why do we no longer see development of open bolt submachine guns? Is the restriction on open bolts on the US civilian market making it not profitable, or am I wrong entirely? You do see some open bolt guns still being developed, but you have a more overwhelming benefit to closed bolt. On the one hand, they are going to be more complicated in the firing mechanism, but that's not as substantial as the difference between simple blowback and delayed blowback. An open bolt gun is not going to be viable on the US commercial market, which is a huge part of the potential sales for almost any firearm being developed these days. Open bolt also is harder to shoot simple, careful, accurate single shots. A closed bolt gun, the problem with an open bolt is when you pull the trigger, the first thing that happens is your heavy bolt goes slamming forward, picks up a cartridge and chambers it, and then fires it. And especially in something like that, that's open bolt and simple blowback, that's a hefty bolt. You're talking about the bolt weighs a pound or more, and that slamming forward is hard to aim around. You have to have really good follow through to make good, accurate shots, single shots on an open bolt gun. Closed bolt, much simpler. The bolt's already closed. You pull the trigger, you can get a nice, crisp trigger pull. Nothing much happens, much less follow through involved, and you can make an accurate single shot. So a lot of the users of submachine guns do value the ability to make accurate single shots. One would hope that that would include like all police agencies, and I think the vast majority it does. But militaries as well ought to value that. Whether they value it more than all the other factors involved is up to them. But those two combined, the U.S. market and single shot accuracy, are why there's so much less open bolt development going on today. Christian says, why did the UD-42 have magazines that are permanently coupled together? This is the United Defense / Marlin Model 42 submachine gun. Originally made in 45 for Army trials. The Army rejected it on the grounds of, we just don't need this. We've already got submachine guns. They then made it in 9mm and sold a bunch of them to the Dutch for the East Indies, where they promptly piled up on the docks because by the time they were ready to ship, the Japanese were in control of the Dutch East Indies. A lot of those guns ended up being acquired by the OSS and dropped into Europe. Anyway, this is a gun that had a 20-round standard box magazine, looks very similar to a Thompson magazine, but in 9mm. And they're also known for having factory-made magazines where there are two of these 20-rounders welded back to back so that one of them feeds at the top end and one feeds at the bottom end. And I think the idea was just, what's the cheapest, quickest way we can make an extended magazine, give guys a way to carry more ammo on the gun, and it's basically just the same as permanently jungle clipping two mags together. There are downsides to this. If you go prone with a magazine like this, you stand a very good chance of just plonking the second magazine feed lips directly into dirt or mud or rocks or whatever, and either jamming the magazine full of crap or bending the feed lips if it's on a rock or something. But it does give you, there's a very tactical view of it as I've got 20 rounds in the gun, and then all I have to do is go put it back in on the other side, and I've got another 20 rounds ready to go. Again, the people using firearms are often not nearly as thoughtful and nerdy about them as the people watching hour-long Q&A videos about firearms, and as a result, you will see a lot of pictures from a lot of wars of people jungle taping magazines together in ways that you look at and you go, is that really a good idea? Maybe it's not a good idea, but that doesn't stop some people from doing it. And if you're the guy running the magazine factory and you have a way to make a more tactical double capacity magazine without literally having to change any of your tooling and just come up with one little machine that spot welds two magazine bodies together, that seems like a pretty darn good solution. To be clear though, it wasn't the original magazine, and it wasn't all the magazines. It's not like that's the only thing they made. They made standard, just single 20-round mags, and then someone came up with the idea of also making a double version that would hold 40. Daniel says, if I wanted to go learn to shoot a submachine gun, where should I go to learn that? That's a tricky question. The snarky answer is the Army or the police, although frankly, these days, neither the Army nor the police is probably very likely to teach you how to use a submachine gun until you get into a specialized sort of sub-unit dealing with them. There are rental ranges that would happily rent you a submachine gun. There are a bunch of them in Vegas, and there are others around other places. A lot of shooting ranges have expanded into having some full auto guns that they rent to shooters. However, that is going to be an extremely expensive way to get any significant level of practice on anything. They're charging pretty exorbitant rates for the exotic experience of shooting a submachine gun. And if you want to learn how to do it well, you're going to need to put thousands of rounds downrange, which means you're now on to the options of find a friend who owns one who will let you shoot it, or buy your own and shoot it a bunch. That's pretty much it. On that subject, Nick says, with Knob Creek not happening anymore, are there any other national level submachine gun matches? I honestly don't know. So I tell you what, if you know of a national level style submachine gun match, let me know down in the comments. Let's crowdsource this one. I know like the local ranges near me, the ranges in Phoenix in particular, or Phoenix and Tucson, well, Phoenix in particular, have they've expanded some of their PCC matches to be specifically submachine gun matches. That said, competition with a full auto firearm is a whole different ball of wax than the normal competition. and generally speaking, far less competitive. If you want to win a competition, if you have a machine gun, leave it on semi. If you don't have a machine gun, congratulations, you've already got the best system for winning a competitive shooting match. I've said this once already. I really need to do a full video on that subject, and I will at some point here. Tim says, I recently shot a full auto MP5 and realized the trigger is quite bad. Is that common for submachine guns, and why? Yes, it is pretty common for two reasons. A lot of them are relatively simple guns that do not have finely honed trigger and sear surfaces like your Gunsmith Tune 1911. They have a big honkin' sear with a big spring on it, and you pull trigger and sear goes down, and there's a lot of friction between the sear and the bolt, and the sear drags off the bolt, and then the bolt goes forward and fires. And you want a lot of interaction for that to be safe, and they're open bolt full auto guns, so people aren't really looking for bullseye accuracy in them. HK in particular has a legacy of a significant drop safe requirement on the trigger mechanism, which is responsible for all of the roller delayed HK triggers being kind of on the meh side. They're relatively heavy and long, so that you can drop them from ridiculously high heights and the trigger won't bounce and fire. But yeah, that's pretty common on submachine guns. Finding a submachine gun with a really good trigger is a notable and unusual event. Andrew says, I'd like to know where your thoughts are on where submachine gun development would have gone if large caliber rifles, battle rifles, had remained standard. Would they eventually scale up to fill the M4 sized void? I don't think so. I think that the scaling down of rifles from, well, initially from 45 caliber black powder down to 30 caliber full power rifle cartridges down to intermediate cartridges like 5.56 and 5.45 was inevitable and was definitely going to happen. And if for some reason the 5.56 cartridge hadn't come about in the M16, in the AR-15 platform, something else would have come along in that same scale before the submachine guns got bigger to get to the same point. Christian says, are there any large production submachine guns that are not in 9mm, Russian 7.62 Tokarev and 45 not included? Well, so yes, there are, and right off the bat, two of the big ones you have excluded there. There are also more than a couple submachine guns in 32 ACP. Scorpion, VZ61 Scorpion was definitely a large major production gun. There are also a number of guns in 9mm Makarov. You have the French, of course, had 7.65 French long submachine guns. One, basically, but there were a couple sub-variants of the thing. Yeah, the 9 Makarov guns are definitely out there, but they're not nearly as well known in the US because they weren't built in forms that were really viable for importation and exposure on the US market. You don't have Polish and Russian and other, Eastern Bloc Cold War submachine guns flooding the US market. What else? If you want to consider 30 carbine a submachine gun cartridge, there have been a couple of guns that would fit that concept. That's pretty much most of it. 10mm, there are definitely 10mm submachine guns out there. Early on, there were actually a surprising number of submachine guns in 7.65 Parabellum, in 7.63 Mauser, in 9x23, in 9x25. The reason we see mostly 9mm is most people are using 9mm pistols, and it makes sense for them to have the same ammo for their submachine guns. Michael says, what is the most fun 22 long rifle full auto to shoot? What subguns are your favorites and why? Well, I like that thing, but it's not in 22 long rifle. To me, the coolest 22 machine gun to shoot is the American 180. I hear a lot of people talk very highly of the 1022 conversions, and I'm sure they are fun. Anything in 22 rimfire is going to be fun to shoot because they're relatively quiet, they're easy to suppress. Even if they're not suppressed with a set of hearing protection, you're not going to have a lot of blast or concussion coming out of them. And they're super low recoil and super easy to shoot. And if I'm going to have fun with that, to me, the best way to do it is to double down on it, go for the 275 round magazine capacity of the American 180, and just basically have a water hose of 22 caliber bullets. It's a lot of fun. ACC asks, is there real functional value in the quality construction of first-generation submachine guns, or are they just overly complicated ways of getting to the exact same result as simple blowback, stamped sheet metal, folding stock, third-gen onward submachine guns? In terms of function, there's really no benefit. The truly objective, practical, like, which is better at putting bullets downrange, they're both identical. The cheap ones are cheaper, of course. Now, the stamped ones tend to have less friendly handling, especially with collapsing and folding stocks. Those tend to be not nearly as comfortable to use as the solid wood stock of a first-generation submachine gun. Sometimes grips, a Sten gun sucks to hold on to. Not all of the first-gen guns, not many of the first-gen guns actually, had pistol grips though, and to my mind, a pistol grip really does help in the handling of a submachine gun. So, but the construction itself, just discreetly as construction, does it contribute anything practical to the gun? No, it doesn't. They only did it because I think basically they didn't realize, like, oh wait, stamping is an option? We can do that? We're definitely going to start doing that. All right, next up is Leon. Not sure if it's entirely appropriate here. Is the concept of the PDW dead? With the apparent lack of adoption and so few historic examples, is it just another dead end in firearms development? No, I don't think so. But I think it was always going to be a specialized, limited application element of firearms design. A PDW is basically a gun meant for people who shouldn't need to have a gun. It's a gun for someone whose job is driving a tank or flying an airplane, or, carrying messages behind the lines, or working in some base where you don't expect enemy soldiers to show up and start shooting the place up. And so it's never going to be the weapon that you want to give to large-scale infantry troops. Either you give the standard infantry weapon to all the rear echelon guys just to simplify things, or if you're going to make a special weapon, it's going to be only for the guys who don't really need it, which kind of, like, most armies are going to have more guys that need the guns than don't, or than guys who don't need the guns but are going to get one anyway. And PDWs are, I guess, even a more specialized version of that role, because you could give a pistol to a lot of guys. Officers get pistols, typically speaking. They don't need PDWs, but they get pistols for the same role. So PDWs keep showing up. They keep coming back. Some of them become very popular, like the M1 carbine. Some of them don't. And I think we get a false impression of the popularity and the utility and how important a PDW ought to be when you see very specialized elite units using PDWs for very specialized reasons. So the MP7 has no right to be nearly as important or popular of a weapon as pop culture has made it. And it got made into that largely because you saw, like, the SEALs going in and whacking bin Laden with MP7s. You saw very high-speed, low-drag guys with MP7s, and thus people decide, oh, well, if those guys have it, it must be the best thing. The reality is it's going to be the best thing for a very specific circumstance, and if it were anybody other than tiered AAA alpha guys doing that specific mission, they'd be doing it with their standard issue carbine or whatever their standard issue firearms are. And it would, the PDW is going to be 5 or 10% more efficient at whatever that mission is. And so the guys who get to choose anything are going to choose PDWs for that very specialized thing. Everybody else would accomplish that same mission with a gun that still got the job done, just not quite as perfectly. Chris says, Thompson had an oversized 45 cartridge at one point. If I remember correctly, Thompson Center, if that had been adopted, what difference would it have caused, potentially creating the automatic carbine earlier? Nope, we can cut this one off. That was the Remington-Thompson cartridge. It was a little bit bigger, but not much bigger. It was a 250 grain bullet in a case that was about 2 millimeters longer than regular 45. So 45 ACP is a 23 millimeter case. This was 10% longer, or a tenth of an inch longer, so 2.5 millimeters longer. It was like 11.3 by 25, or maybe by 26. 250 grains as compared to the standard 230 grain weight of regular 45 auto. It probably had a slightly higher velocity, although I didn't come across the velocity in a quick check on the cartridge. But no, it would have been, 10 millimeter is almost certainly a more powerful cartridge than 45 Remington-Thompson. The idea was, can we squeeze a little bit more power into the existing receiver of this gun and then sell it to naive militaries in the 20s and 30s as a replacement for their light machine guns? The answer was no, because they only made 2 of them. And no, that cartridge was definitely a dead end. It's like inverse 45 gap. Brian says, you're teleported back to medieval times. You can choose any submachine gun in a backpack full of as many loaded magazines as you can carry. You won't have any cleaning supplies or replacement parts available. What subgun do you choose to become king of the land and build an army to follow you? Perhaps something you can effectively wield one-handed, so to have a shield. To my mind, something 22. My initial thought was an American 180, but if I don't have cleaning supplies, like there's a lot you can do just by scrubbing the thing out with a rag and some oil. Like there is oil in medieval times. You can get your hands on oil, but I don't know that I want to deal with those magazines. And to me, the benefit of a 22 caliber submachine gun in this totally fictitious sci-fi scenario is I want to have as much ammunition as possible, because I'm definitely not getting more ammo. And once the hordes of peasants and other subjects realize that my boomstick is now a click stick, then I'm going out real fast, I would expect. So if I can get 10,000 rounds of ammunition with me because it's 22 rimfire, great, I'll go with that. And probably put that submachine gun in single shot mode and just blow the minds of everybody with single shots from the boomstick, where 22 is a bigger gun than they've seen anywhere anyway. Plan 9 from Kansas says 45 ACP was known to be a poor barrier penetrator as early as the 1930s, thus the development of the 357 Magnum and the 38 Super. Why did America enter World War II with a subgun chambered in 45 ACP and then replace it with another one in 45 ACP? The reason was we used 45 ACP in the pistols. Also, the submachine gun that was available was the Thompson. Now, the Thompson was made in 45 because the pistols were in 45, but the Thompson was not created by the military. The Thompson was, well, General Thompson was in the military, but the Thompson Auto Ordnance Company was a private company developing the guns for private sale to whoever wanted them. They're going to go with the military cartridge. This was before the creation of either of those before 357 or 38. They made one run of Thompson submachine guns in 1921, and those were all of the Thompsons that existed until like 1938, because the Thompson was really expensive and not that popular. So there was never a 38 Super Thompson in like the mid-1930s, because while the 38 Super was being developed at that point, the Thompsons already existed, and no one was going to go back and try and retrofit the Thompson and its giant milled receiver and magazines to fit a smaller diameter cartridge. So the US gets the Thompson to start with, and they don't need a lot of them, and they don't see them as particularly valuable weapons, so they're not doing a lot of R&D in new submachine guns. So Thompson it is, and because it's Thompson, it's 45. And then once the war starts, it takes a major program to do anything logistical around new cartridges. And we see that with 30 carbine, but the 30 carbine I think makes a lot more sense in a military context than 38 Super would have. All right, we got 3 more questions here. The next one is from Northern Relish, who says, given that submachine guns were intended from the start to be close range and automatic firing, quickly emptying magazines, why, other than a few exceptions, weren't bayonets put on them to give the user an extra option should it be necessary? That is a very good question. So first off, more submachine guns had bayonets than you might realize. But even among those that didn't, a lot of times the military doctrine around a submachine gun was not issuing it to everybody. Like the Russians were kind of an outlier in that. The submachine guns went to special troops. They went to officers. They went to unit leaders. They went to guys who were doing some other stuff, maybe dispatch riders. People who weren't like just the general line infantry. The line infantry had rifles, and they had bayonets on those rifles. The submachine guns are not nearly as common in the units, and they are generally not nearly as useful as bayonet platforms as a rifle. They're going to be a lot shorter. One of the benefits of the submachine gun that a lot of people tried to exploit was compactness, give it a folding stock. Those folding stocks, the better they are for being compact, the worse they typically are for being a good, sturdy way to hold on to the gun and stab someone with it. You also tend to have short barrels. The bayonet on the end of a short rifle, or on the end of a short firearm, is just a lot less useful. So I understand the point you're making, but I think there are reasonable counter arguments. It is a little bit surprising to me that like the Papasha 41 didn't have a bayonet attachment on it, but that may just have been a matter of they literally didn't have the money to buy the bayonets for them. Like when you look at the bayonet on the most Nagant, it's not the world's most sophisticated, expensive bayonet. It's just a giant screwdriver. Matt says, reviving a Moons Out conversation, discuss the viability or lack thereof of a magnetic delayed blowback mechanism. Yes, so Matt and I were chatting at Moons Out at our night rifle match this past spring, a couple months ago, and he brought up the idea of magnetic delayed blowback, which sounds really cool and is actually pretty much totally non-viable. So there are a couple, the cool sounding thing is you've got magnets, they either attract or repel each other depending on how they're set up. They don't require batteries, they don't require power sources, they just work. So why would you not use magnets as like the buffer to stop the bolt traveling, or as a way to lock the bolt in place forward while you're firing a cartridge? And the answer is there are a couple of very problematic practical elements with magnets. One is the force implied by a magnet is all right, let me figure out how to say this, sorry. The force exerted by a magnet is proportional to the inverse of the square of the distance from the magnet. So if you're 1 millimeter away from a magnet, you get X force. If you're 2 millimeters away, you get the square root of X force. And if you are 4 millimeters away, you get the fourth root of the force. In other words, it takes very little difference in distance from a magnet to have totally wildly different force coming out of that magnet. And what that means is you can't have you have to have very, very close tolerances when you're designing a system that's based on magnetic attraction or repulsion. And a little dinky layer of dirt is going to interfere with those distances. Either it will create enough friction that the gun won't work. Like if you've got the tolerances close enough on the gun that it'll function, the dirt's going to get in and it's just going to jam the whole thing up. Or if you have the tolerances wide enough that you have space for dirt to get in, ignoring the fact that the dirt is often, at least out here in the Southwest, going to be magnetic and stick to the bits of the gun instead of falling out when it can. If you've got tolerances wide enough to survive having some dirt and gunk in the gun, it also means that your moving parts have the tolerances to move back and forth enough to get very significant differences in applied force from the magnets. Now, the second problem you're going to get is heat. The energy in, like if you use magnets as a buffer, the energy that they absorb doesn't just disappear, it turns into heat. And that's not a big deal for most applications, but if you've got a submachine gun hammering back and forth on a magnetic buffer, that magnet's going to heat up. And oh, by the way, the force you get from magnets is also highly correlated to their temperature. And if the magnet heats up, it's going to become a lot less effective. So that's an issue with a buffer going back and forth. It's really an issue in a locking system right up next to all the very hot elements of the chamber of a firearm. So magnets sound cool. I would be very surprised to see them have any truly practical application in firearms locking or buffering systems. We've seen some people try it, and all the examples have either been essentially blish lock, where yeah, there are magnets in it, but it turns out the system works just fine based on like the mass of the system if you get rid of the magnets, or they're truly magnetic systems and they fail. And our last question here is from Dave. Says, it is well known that burst fire operation, as opposed to true full auto, tends to be significantly less effective. I don't know if that's well known. It's certainly an opinion that I have, but do you think that this is true with machine pistols like the Beretta 93R, or would that be a rare case of a burst being a better option compared to something like a true full auto Glock 18? So in general, I don't like burst limiters on full auto, 2, 3, 4 round bursts. They tend to add complexity to a trigger mechanism. And for rifle type platforms, submachine gun platforms, I don't think they're really necessary. I think they are a crutch to avoid a use, like an important level of training in the utilization of the full auto. If you need a burst mechanism, maybe you should give guys semi-autos. If you have a full auto, you should practice with it to the point that you can fire bursts without needing a mechanical burst limiting system. All that being said, I have the opposite opinion on machine pistols. Machine pistols are way harder to control because you don't have 3 points of contact. You only have the gun in the hand. And I think, and they also tend to have much higher rates of fire because they have much lighter reciprocating parts. They cycle faster. And I think a burst limiter in a machine pistol is actually a pretty darn good idea, because it is possible that there are some people who are really skilled with machine pistols and they can fire whatever length of burst they want, do full mag dumps, fully controlled, but I don't think that's particularly common. It's a lot harder to get that level of skill than it is equivalent skill with a rifle or a submachine gun. Frankly, the concept of a machine pistol is pretty dubious in the first place, the utility of it. If you're gonna have it, I totally understand putting a burst limiter on it, and I think that's probably a good idea. The Beretta 93R did it right there. Glock, Glock has just pure open-ended full auto because it's a very simple conversion for the Glock, and they don't have space under grip panels because they don't have grip panels to work with. There's not necessarily the room in a Glock mechanism to build in a burst. When you see it on machine pistols like the Beretta, you'll see it built in under the grip panels on the side of the magazine well. Anyway, that has been a whole bunch of questions. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. We got a lot of really good questions on this month's submachine gun theme, so thank you to everyone on Patreon who made the Q&A possible. Once again, if you would like to submit questions, if you'd like to have early access to videos, if you would like to have an ad-free feed of all Forgotten Weapons videos in your email every day when they come out, check out patreon.com/forgottenweapons. Sign up, help support the channel, and get yourself some cool perks. Thanks for watching.